My name is Joe Aiello. I am the National Field Coordinator for the association. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what you'll be seeing today. We'll start off with Jeans-Gail, our Vice President of Government Affairs and Policy. He'll be giving you an update on what's going on the legislative side. Then we will be joined by a couple of our union friends, Ron Kaminkow from the Brotherhood of BLET, Division 51 and Railroad Workers United, Brian Eden from Smart TD, Local 1470, and then our own President and CEO, Jim Mathews, will be joining for a great conversation. Then we'll toss it over to Madi Butler, our communications manager, who will be moderating our Q&A. With that said, I introduce Jeans-Gail and with the legislative updates.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks to our panelists and for everyone joining us today. I think we should have a really good agenda, and I'm excited to hear from it. And so I'm going to try to keep my section brief but informative. The reason we wanted to kind of open with this is there are a lot of developments legislatively that will inform the discussion we're about to have. It's been a very action-filled few weeks here on Capitol Hill, and we want to make sure that we're all on the same page and that everyone's up to speed. So Joe, can I have the next slide? Thank you. So there has been a pretty big breakthrough as of this week. I was very pessimistic towards the end of last week about where the relief package was going to head, but there are bipartisan negotiators, kind of the four corners of the House and the Senate from both parties, as well as a group of bipartisan senators have struck a deal where they're going to separate some of the real points of controversy, and that includes state and local aid payments, as well as liability protections for businesses that are looking to operate during the pandemic. They're going to take that off of the main bill and focus the $748 billion coronavirus relief package on payments to important sectors of the economy, payments to workers, unemployed, and payments to businesses. And we, through the hard work of this organization, our members, as well as many other stakeholder groups, we were able to get transportation included in that $748 billion, which will be attached to kind of the continuing resolution omnibus, which will fund the government for the rest of FY 2021, which goes through September 30th, 2021. There are still some real hurdles to clear. The size and shape of unemployment insurance, as well as stimulus payments, is still under debate right now. And they were working till late last night, I believe, trying to hammer out those deals. However, when they came out of that meeting, you had both Senator Mitch McConnell and House Majority Leader Nancy Pelosi saying they both felt optimistic about reaching a deal. They have until Friday to hit the deadline and avoid a government shutdown. It's possible they do another 7-week extension to give them more time. No one really wants to do that, obviously. It's the general shape of the agreement is, but it's a very large bill. There are a lot of technical corrections that still need to be made. We're still working with offices on making sure that our language gets in terms of policy writers, if not funding levels. So there's the potential that we kick the can down the road another 7 days. Joe, can I get the next slide, please? So here you can see the funding levels that we secured for transportation, for rail. That's $1 billion for Amtrak and $15 billion for transit. That's well below the requested levels for FY 2021, which again goes through September of next year. 2.4 billion is what Amtrak requested to get everything back in good working order. And transit through APTA has requested at least 32 billion. However, the real needs are probably much higher than that because ridership remains really stubbornly low, and for a lot of agencies, that's their main source of revenue. The one important caveat here is the drafters of the bill have made it very clear that this bill includes funding through March 31st, so the first quarter of the new year. That's important because if you kind of prorate that across the entire year, you see we're actually a lot closer to what the real needs are. And in fact, in some cases, we might be above that. Airlines got 17 billion, airports 4 billion. That's a recurring thing that we'll all be fairly familiar with if we've paid attention. Amtrak is always the one who gets hit for getting subsidies, but it's the mode of transportation that members of Congress use every week to get back in district that ends up getting the most in the way of the bailouts and annual subsidies. Joe, can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So looking closer at these numbers, Amtrak's going to get 1 billion, and they're going to break that down across 2 accounts with a couple set-asides: 580 million for the NEC, with 91 million set aside for Northeast Corridor commuter railroads. And we'll also see 420 million for National Network, which includes long distance and state supported. And there will be a 145 million set aside in lieu of Section 209 payments, which are made from states to Amtrak. Transit, 15 billion. The majority of that, 13 billion, is going to go to urbanized area formula grants. No urbanized area may receive more than 4 billion. That's probably a very specific set aside, policy provision written for New York City's MTA, which is struggling mightily right now, and can probably take 12 billion if they were given the opportunity. But they want appropriators and drafters of this want to see it kind of spread around. They have a 1 billion set aside for rural areas, an additional pot of money there, 628 million for agencies that are going to need a little extra help above what they get in their formula. Can I get the next slide, Joe? So in terms of policy provisions, it's still pretty vague. I think they're still writing the bill right now, kind of trying to flesh things out. The one really clear thing is, they don't want any more cuts to service on transit systems, and they don't want any more furloughs or layoffs for the labor force. And the same is true of Amtrak. They don't clarify whether this is going to sunset at March 31st and then furloughs are back on the menu. So it's a little hard to read between the lines there and see what the congressional intent is. I think they're going to kind of work to develop that idea, and we're still fighting for restoration of daily service in this package. Our argument here, and I think the facts back us up, is that if this is only going through March 31st, that's more than enough money to restore daily service on the long distances. In addition, just thinking logistically through this problem, you can't just like flip a switch and get those trains back on the track. So it's going to take a little bit of time to get those trains up and running. And I think that gives us enough of a runway, so to speak, to make sure that there's something on April 1st waiting for them in terms of funding. So I think we still have an opportunity. We still have our campaign up. We've contacted thousands. We have had thousands of contacts to hundreds of offices over the last 2 weeks. We'll post that action link in the chat before this is over. Hope you all take part. And one way or the other, we're gonna have a lot of work to do in 2021. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, is how we can work with our allied organizations to be more effective in that campaign. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my boss, Jim Mathews, who's president and CEO of Rail Passengers, and he'll kind of set up the next section. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sean. As I hope everyone can see, we've been a very busy team here at the Rail Passengers, especially in the past couple of weeks. I'm really excited to introduce our panel. We've been looking forward to this one for quite some time. I'll begin with Ron Kaminkow. He grew up in Baltimore, Maryland in the 1960s and the 70s. Prior to hiring out on the railroad in 1996, Ron worked at a number of jobs, union and non-union. He gained valuable experience as a worker, union steward, an organizer, and a local officer. He hired out with Conrail as a brakeman in 1996. He was promoted to conductor the next year and then engineer in 1998 before coming to Amtrak in 2004. After working out of both Milwaukee and Chicago crew bases, Ron migrated to Reno, Nevada, where he works as an engineer on the California Zephyr. All told, he has railroaded in 8 states over most of the Class 1 railroads, and he currently serves as the vice president and delegate of his local union, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, Division 51. And for the past 12 years, he's also served as the general secretary of the Cross Craft Group Railroad Workers United. And before we get to Ron, I just want to briefly introduce our second panelist, Brian Eden. He's been with Amtrak since February 1989, where Brian started as a laborer on the auto train. He transferred at Washington, D.C. South in April of 1990. He worked there until June of 2016, transferred to Washington North. He was vice chairman for VRE conductors at the end of Amtrak's contract with VRE in 2010. All cards on the table. I've known Brian for many years before I came to the association because he was my conductor on my VRE commuter train out of Bristow. He was also president of Local 1933 from 2013 to 2016 and vice local chairman for 1470 since November of 2018. Brian's dad, Eugene Eden, started at Amtrak on day one as an accountant, worked his way up to vice president of passenger services until he retired in 1992. And one more fun holiday fact that Brian shared with us, Amtrak ran a Christmas commercial with him 2 years ago. It was only shown online and in the stations. He's the conductor who saved the stuffed animal. And I sent him a note when I first saw that, and I said, I need an autograph. And so far, Brian has failed to comply. But first, we'll start with Ron Kaminkow, who, in addition to the bio that he has shared with us today, he's also a council member of your Rail Passengers Association. So I welcome him to lead off the panel. Ron, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
All right, wonderful. Yeah, as Jim said, I was glad you didn't omit that. I am the council representative since, I believe, 2017 when there was a vacancy here in Nevada. And I kind of stepped up to do that. And it was a bit of a test of the waters for me because I was wondering if a group like Rail Passengers Association would actually be interested in having a locomotive engineer be a council rep. And to my delight, they like my credentials and offered me the position. So I've been serving in it ever since. Anyway, we'll try to keep it as brief as possible. And that way we'll have more time for question and answer in the session to follow. I'm going to defer to my colleague, Brian Eden, to talk about some of the other stuff. And what I'm going to focus on today is basically about the need, the pressing need, the urgent need for what it says there on your screen, building a coalition of railroad workers and our allies. And in this case, on today's webinar, to specifically talk about building that alliance between passengers and rail advocates on the one hand, and railroad workers and our unions on the other hand. For a lot of us, or some of us at least, this seems like a natural fit and a natural coalition. However, if we actually look at what's happened over probably the last 100 years, let's say, it's been lacking. Just a bit of self-criticism. We can do better. We can do a lot better. And so I'm just going to focus a little bit on that today before we get into Brian's presentation and then the Q&A. So the group that I've been very involved in, along with my unions, I came out of the UTU and then went into the BLET when I went into engine service with Amtrak. But in 2008, a number of us came together throughout the country to form something called Railroad Workers United. And the idea was we have 12 different craft unions on the railroad. And even they don't always stick together. In some cases, they actually undermine each other's efforts. And so the idea is we need to build bigger and bigger, larger and larger circles of inclusivity and solidarity. So we started to do that. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, we wanted to expand beyond the rail labor workforce. Why? Well, we used to have 2 million railroad workers in this country alone when the country had half the population. Now we have twice as many people, but our numbers have dropped to just 10%. We have under 200,000 rail workers in the United States. And so we need to build allies. It's just a fundamental political question. So where do you find these allies? Well, in the this past decade, around 2014, 2015, a whole series of oil train explosions, derailments took place, and the environmental community got very, very concerned about railroad safety. We've always been very concerned about railroad safety because our lives are on the line. We're the frontline workers, and when there's derailments or crashes, obviously, we are the ones who stand to lose the most. So railroad workers have always been very, very concerned about railroad safety. When we reached out to the community, we were delighted to find that there were countless environmental groups, community associations all over the country who were hungry to build alliance with us, who wanted to get to know who we were, who were thrilled to have railroad workers in the room. And we sponsored a series of conferences where we had groups like the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, some of these you've heard of, some of them I've heard of, but others, the Center for Biological Diversity, Climate Solutions, Keepers of the Athabasca Watershed, Power Pass Coal, Richmond Environmental Justice Coalition. The list goes on. And so we met numerous activists. Many of them were trade unionists themselves, but their primary focus was environmental action. To our delight, they all supported railroads. They all want railroad expansion, both freight and passenger in particular. And we see the environmental movement not as our enemies, but as our friends. Are we in lockstep? No. Do we reserve the right to have our own agenda? Yes. Do they have the right to reserve their own agenda? Absolutely. If not, we'd be the same organization, but we have our bailiwick, they have theirs. But like the old Venn diagram, there's a huge intersection of those two circles, and therefore we need to be working together. Often you'll hear it's a question of jobs versus the environment. We don't think so. We think we can have plenty of jobs, plenty of trains, and a protected environment and safe and healthy working conditions. So this is the background of which I came out of in this effort to start building broader coalitions outside of the labor movement, outside of the rail unions. And so in 2016, we adopted a resolution where we took the position that railroad workers and railroad advocates need to work together. So the timing was impeccable when the Nevada Council of Representatives position came available and I was appointed to it. Railroad Workers United then joined RPA as a member organization, and a number of our activists have joined RPA. And I should mention that some RPA members have joined Railroad Workers United as what we call a solidarity member. They don't get a vote, they can't sit on the steering committee or leadership bodies, but they do have full voice in the affairs of the organization. So we're starting to build that alliance now, not just with environmental groups, but also with rail advocates. Now, why is this so essential? The short answer is we want to win. And how do you win in politics? You start to make friends. You start to build a coalition. A union is a coalition, right? We got high senior and low senior people. We got people in the yard, people on the road, people in passenger, people in freight. So the union's a big coalition. All of us that are interested in seeing the advancement of rail passenger trains in this country, we're a coalition. Now, a lot of times you'll have railroad workers who have no use for advocates. They're not interested in passengers. They're not interested in RPA or groups like that. And I'll get to that in just a minute. But first, so why is it essential? We want the same things. Workers want better wages, benefits. We want safety on the job, healthy conditions. We want to see an expansion of the rail industry. Well, passengers and advocacy groups, they want something very similar: more trains, on-time performance, a safe environment. Once again, expansion of the infrastructure, more trains, which of course for the unions and the workforce will translate into more jobs, more employment, more security. So we hear all these slogans, united we stand, divided we fall. In numbers, there's strength. In unity, there's strength. What we cannot do alone, we can do together. We don't want our enemies to divide and conquer us. I mean, these are out of the lexicon of common everyday language. And we need to start practicing that. And we need to start figuring out who are our friends and who are our enemies. And I was just thinking before this, that old slogan, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so it's important to look at who are the people who are opposed to the expansion of rail transportation. A lot of big, powerful corporations. The Koch brothers actively lobby to undermine local coalitions that attempt to expand transit in places like Phoenix and Nashville and other communities. The Koch brothers are also vehemently anti-union. So, like I say, we need to look around and see, who are we in this with? Who are we in the same boat with? Not necessarily in the identical exact position, but we have a lot more in common than we have that divides us. So to conclude, I'll just say, how do we build this? How do we get started? Well, I think there's a lot of good examples that have taken place in this past year of struggle, and we'll get to those in a minute. First, we have to get away from this culture of railroad workers looking towards advocacy groups as, you know, derogatory, foamers, wannabes, geeks, whatever. I've heard it all in my 25 years on the railroad. I'm sure Brian has as well. On the other side, we see advocates. Unions are feather bedding. Unions are only concerned about their own self-interest. They're a special interest group. They have no long-term perspective, et cetera, all of which I say we got to debunk that. Because if we're going to like each other and build an alliance with each other, we have to get past these stereotypes, and we have to get past this, I don't know what to call it, cultural divide nonsense. So just because we're from different socioeconomic backgrounds, or we hang out with a different crowd of people, or we use a different slang or language, we have to understand you got to get past that. You got to work with people that, you know, you don't have to drink beer with these people. You don't have to be friends with these people, but you got to work with them. Just like inside the union, we got to work together. We have to support each other. And we have to understand that our futures are inextricably linked. So it's kind of dark here. What we both want. Yeah, I already went through that. Better service, on-time performance, more trains, more routes, more frequencies, railroad safety, good staff morale, something that's very important to us on the trains and something that's very important to you riding the trains. We want staff who are high quality and excited to be there and proud to be doing their jobs. We need adequate funding, long-term planning, improved infrastructure. All of those things the unions want, the railroad workers want, the advocacy groups want, and the passengers want. So specifically, what we can do, and I'll just wind it up here, we can speak at each other's meetings. Today's a perfect example. RPA has invited us to be here, Brian and I, which is a major development. In turn, the unions should think about inviting representatives, Sean or Jim or Joe or others, to speak at their meetings. Let's get to know each other. Let's get to kind of like cross that initial threshold, because most of us have never even met each other. We need to conduct joint actions. Once again, in the last few months, we've seen a lot of progress. The TCU Smart Transportation Division has worked hand in glove with RPA to pull off rallies at different stations around the country, including my old station I used to work out of, Chicago Union Station. We need to join each other's organizations when possible. Passengers aren't part of our bargaining unit, and under US labor law, that's not a possible thing to do. I did mention earlier, you can join our RWU as a solidarity member. But all railroad workers have the ability to join RPA. And I think it's $50 or $60 a year. I mean, we're paying union dues of $100, $150 a month. There's not a railroader out there that couldn't afford that $50. And I encourage every single railroader to, if you don't like RPA, there's lots of other organizations in the field that are doing rail advocacy work. I highly recommend joining RPA, but join a couple of them. I have. As far as I'm concerned, if you have a local group, join it. Also join RPA. Get involved and bring that cross-pollination between railroad workers and passengers and advocates. Affiliate with one another. Railroad Workers United is now an official affiliate organization of Railroad Passengers Association. I would encourage the unions, particularly the BMWED, BLET, and Smart Transportation Division, and TCU, probably the 4 biggest unions and the 4 biggest at Amtrak, should all get together, start talking negotiation. How can they actually affiliate and pay a very small per capita tax? You're talking organizations with 30 or 40,000 members that if they paid a small per capita tax each month, I'm talking 5 or 10 cents per member per month, you could raise $30, $40, $50,000 for groups like RPA, who then go to bat for us, the workers and our unions. So yeah, I'm getting to the end here, so please bear with me. We need to publicly support each other's actions. Don't forget about each other, so that when the unions or Railroad Workers United or what have you promote ourselves, we always remember to promote our allies, the advocacy groups. And by the same token, when Jim does a press conference, Sean and others, remember, bring up the unions, bring up the workforce, get that in the public's mind, get the public thinking in terms of worker support as well as passenger and rail support. We need to lobby together, so when we go to Capitol Hill or even at the states, we can go in with each other. If we're going to go in and see a congressional representative or senator, why not go in as, yeah, we have an advocate, we have a member of the Sierra Club, and we have a member of the BLET or Smart TD or what have you. And that will really impress legislators to see that kind of cooperation and coalition being built amongst us. We should address one another at our conventions. I've been the delegate from my division to the BLET National Convention in Las Vegas the last couple times. We have all kinds of guest speakers, all kinds of politicians. It would be great to have somebody from Railroad Passengers or one of the other advocacy groups address the hall of 600 delegates and get that message across to railroad workers up close and personal. And then last but not least, let's get to know each other personally. There's nothing like primary relationships, making friends with one another, and sort of like humanizing the other and getting to know their issues. Like I say, we may be coming in general from slightly culturally different backgrounds, but most all of us speak the same language, we eat the same food, and we're both on the trains together. So let's put our parochial differences aside and get to it and start building this alliance today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. I sure appreciate that. And so we'll turn next to Brian Eden. Brian?
Hey, Jim, thank you very much. I'd like to thank you and Joe both for inviting me in. I'm happy to be here talking to members of the Rail Passenger Association. I want to thank you, Ron, for kind words, and we'll get together and we'll work out something together afterwards. I'd like to talk about what's been going on in the government, because that seems to be what's most important to us. We are very excited in the railroad industry, especially in Amtrak, to see Joe Biden become president. We think it's going to be good for Amtrak. Very excited to hear about Pete Buttigieg being nominated as Transportation Secretary. I know he rode Amtrak back and forth to Boston when he was going to college. So, and he's been a big fan of ours for years. So I'm excited to see him in that role. But I want to add to that, we can't think that we just got it across the finish line just because Joe and Pete are there now. Be wonderful if Joe had the ability to wave a wand and give Amtrak everything he needed and bring back all our fellow members to work. But he doesn't have that magic wand. There's a Congress there. And as you well know, right now, we have the House, but we don't have the Senate. So there's going to need to be some work and some compromise. We've got almost 2,000 members that are still out furloughed. Amtrak's been bringing some of them back because they cut a little bit too deeply. So I think we're back down to about 1,400 maybe that are out. But those people are still out over Thanksgiving and now coming Christmas. We're coming into what is probably the slowest time of our year for us when we hit to January. So it's something we're looking forward to working with the new administration to help get our members back, get the trains back, especially the long distance trains, get them back to daily service. But we're going to need your help on that as well. If there's one thing I've learned in my years on this earth is that politicians care when they're made to care. So that means your congressman. Even if your congressman doesn't like Amtrak, you could have the congressman that thinks he's the worst, the Amtrak's the worst thing that ever set foot on this earth. If enough people contact him, he has to pay attention to the fact that that's what his members, his constituents want. So it's going to take phone calls. It's going to take emails. Rail Passenger Association has done an amazing job of helping us get some of those emails out in a way that allows you to do a lot of one touch for those that don't know exactly what to say or how to say it. They can do it in a quick way. But, you know, pester your congressman. Tell him you want Amtrak fully running again. You want to see 7 days a week service on your long distance trains. And explain why. So, you know, I like to be able to know in advance I can get from point A to point B without having to go through point C, D, and E to get there because you changed your schedule around and I can't get from here to there without going 5 other places first. Those are things they need to know. Jim had a great presentation that he did in one of our surface transportation hearings where he showed just how much it affects some of these, what they call flyover country communities that Amtrak serves when all of a sudden Amtrak goes down to 3 days a week. And, you know, it was really impressive with that, Jim. I appreciate that. It helped us out a lot with helping to explain to congressmen just why it mattered 3 days versus 7 days. Going forward, Ron was not wrong. The unions don't always work together in what's best interest for the whole. Sometimes you have to stop and think about what's best interest for the few that's who are paying your dues. It's something we can do better at, and I agree with Ron, we need to do better with. There's been a little war back and forth between the BLE and the UTU. Now the Smart Transportation Division's been going on since as long as I can remember. But it takes both of us to get over the road. So I think there's more we have in common than we don't. I think there's more issues we agree on that we don't. And I think we work better on a local level together than we do on an international, but that's something that we can change from the inside. Don't really have a lot else. That's pretty much what's on my mind. Amtrak is near and dear to my heart. It has put food on my table for 50 years. My father started here when I was just a baby in 1971, directly out of the Marine Corps. And he worked his way up from an accountant, went to night school as a Marine to become an accountant. And he worked his way all the way up to vice president of passenger services when he retired. And now I'm a union member, and he was okay with that. He kind of wanted me to go the management way, but we don't always get what we want. But he was happy that I was at least being involved. And I think that was what my father taught me, is that if you want to have the ability to shape a discussion, to continue in the discussion, you have to be involved. You can't just sit at the sidelines and throw rocks. You've got to get in there and fight. And so that's what I've tried to do. And that's why I hope by being members of Rail Passenger Association, you feel the same way. So we're with you. and we appreciate your help. And I agree with Ron that sometimes the associations can get a bad name as the foamers or whatever you want to call it. But if you've got my back, I've got yours. And that's all I've got. Joe, Jim?
Thanks, Brian. I think wanted to put up some links so that folks can find everybody. And then I think we've got some time for some questions. So it'll be time to turn this over to Madi Butler.
All right, everyone. So we have just a couple questions that were sent in by members. So we're going to jump right into those. Joe, do you want to give me the first slide? So this question, I would like for Jim to answer first. How can passengers and rail advocacy groups support rail workers and their unions? And in turn, how can rail workers and their unions support passengers and advocacy groups?
Well, that's the question of the hour, isn't it? I would say that Brian and Ron both did a tremendous job of answering that in a very concrete way. Certainly working together, supporting each other, visiting each other's meetings, getting to know each other better. All of those are great things. The thing that I would really like to focus on, at least from the rail passengers perspective, though, we have to create a climate in which the environment supports rail workers and their unions, because they in turn are supporting us as passengers, not only organizationally like we're seeing here today, but out on the road. These are the folks that take care of us. These are the folks that make sure that we get down the road safely. These are the folks that make sure that we get where we're trying to go. And so, you know, we all want to work together and help each other. And from a larger point of view, I mean, like so many problems in passenger rail, you're going to hear me say it again, and folks who have been on our webinars before will probably believe that this is the 4,000th time they've heard me say it. But the answer really is predictable, dedicated funding. We can solve a lot of ills by creating that stability, that predictability, to know that we have the wherewithal to invest in growth and sustainment and all of the things that will make our passenger rail systems around the country vibrant and worthwhile. So that means everything from, you know, more frequencies, more equipment, more maintenance bases, more miles of electrified right away. These not only help us as passengers because it gives us more trains to ride, better equipment to ride on, more reliable equipment and so forth, but these are also components of really a thriving rail labor force. And that's really what we work on at the national level, is to try to create that environment in which rail can thrive. And so by extension, we as passengers can get the service that we need, are paying for, frankly deserve, and that our rail labor workforce is taken care of appropriately and respectfully, and has that stability to really do their jobs well and bring more folks into the industry. But certainly, Ron, Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree with you, Jim. It's a all-encompassing approach. Think we're getting better at it as we go along, but you're right. It's not just one thing. It's not just we need more trains back. There's a lot to it, and every little bit of it helps. The maintenance work keeps people in jobs. One of the things that Amtrak discussed, if they could not get increased funding coming in, was sometime soon possibly laying off 750 odd maintenance away workers who are doing the upkeep on the corridor. With this last 8 months, the one silver lining to the slowdown in traffic has been there's been a lot of work done on the Northeast corridor as far as improvements and interlockings, new ties, things of that nature that would have normally taken longer. They've gotten maybe 2.5 years worth of work done in the last 8 months because there just hasn't been train traffic out there. And it would be amazing to continue to be able to take advantage of that open track space, but that's money. You know, that's money coming from the government to upgrade that track work, like they talk about with the Gateway project up and going in New York. It doesn't always sound great to the guys living in Oklahoma, but it is keeping people employed. It is money in the system. And if they've got that, this is work that has to be done anyways. So if that they get extra money for that, that's more money that from some other account that can go elsewhere.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. Can I get our next question, Joe? What is the relationship like between groups representing Amtrak labor and freight company labor? That is, are freight rail labor groups supportive of improved passenger rail service? I'm going to send this question over to Sean first.
Well, I can only speak to the broad trends, and I'm sure Ron and Brian maybe will be able to speak to the specifics. We work with a coalitional group called One Rail that brings together all the interested stakeholders into a room and tries to figure out, what is it that we agree on, and what can we present as a publicly unified face to strengthen rail. And sometimes the answer is not much. Certainly during this last reauthorization cycle, we had a lot of points of disagreement, and I think Amtrak employees and some of the employees of the class ones are dealing with a lot of the same trends, which is they're facing pressure from management to really shrink the network, shrink the footprint of the network, and put more traffic on fewer main lines. I think they're looking to automate where possible and to reduce human workers across the network. The idea is that you do more with less, but usually what ends up happening is you just do less. And so we're obviously as a passenger focused group against that on both fronts, because when the class ones end up reducing the amount of people working on the network and the network fluidity slows down, passengers are the ones who suffer there. We luckily have moved to a new Amtrak CEO who's not been the vocal advocate that previous CEO Richard Anderson was, and I think a lot of that had to do with Congress, putting a line in the sand. But I see a lot of the network forces being the same. And I also wonder if there's not an opportunity there. We've seen in the Commonwealth of Virginia, between Richmond and DC, the Commonwealth take over a mainline corridor and saying this is going to be during the daytime largely a passenger railroad, and we're going to move a lot of people on it, and we're going to make a lot of investments. But then at night, we'll still have mixed use, and I think that kind of public-private partnership where the states are taking the lead could be really beneficial to passengers, but also a growing rail workforce. And then I don't know if Ron or Brian wants to jump in there with some more specific comments on the ties between the groups.
Maddie, I would love to jump in here if I could.
Yep, by all means, Ron, take it away.
Oh, okay. Just wondering if you could hear me. Yeah, it's not as good as it could be, but then I'm always discontent. But there's historical reasons that it's not as good as it could be. In the late 80s, the train and engine craft no longer was in the employ of the freight railroads, and Amtrak took that over. I'm not saying whether that was a good or a bad thing, but what it did was it segregated conductors and engineers into either passenger service or freight service. The freight railroads used to run all of the commuter services in New York and Boston and Chicago. That's all been segregated out. So there's not as much fraternization as there once was. And that's a big problem because people sort of naturally think parochially. I know a lot of Amtrak people, they know no freight people. When I used to work for Conrail and Norfolk Southern, we, other than the old heads who used to work alongside of them, And I did have the good fortune of being a member of UTU Local 168, which was a local that had two local committees in it. We had the Amtrak committee and we had the Conrail committee. And it was nice because we had Amtrak guys who used to be Conrail until about 10 years ago. And then we had the Conrail guys. So there was ability to fraternize. It's a big problem. And in most rail unions, the vast majority of the membership are freight railroaders. And so there's a tendency, of course, it's just the nature of organization, that a lot of freight issues and concerns and questions come to the forefront. However, this could all be changing as the freight industry pares down farther and farther and farther with precision scheduled railroading and all this nonsense, and potentially Amtrak. If you look at California, for example, 25 years ago, there was very few commuter trains, and now we have the Capital Corridor, we have Metrolink, and passenger rail is on the expansion in terms of the number of workers in a state like California. So the balance is maybe being restored in certain locations. Railroaders need to understand how important Amtrak is. If Amtrak were to be carved up and done away with, we're looking at a huge deficit of payments into the railroad retirement system that we all depend on. And, you know, basically it could be our bread and butter for the future. If freight continues to be automated and there's fewer and fewer jobs, which I hope is not going to be the case, but passenger, it looks like in the coming decades is going to play a bigger and bigger role, and that railroad workers, both freight and passenger, you know, need to start advocating on behalf of expanded passenger service. I'm not saying we're there, we got a long way to go, but it's something that we need to work on inside the unions.
Awesome. Thank you, Ron. That makes a lot of sense. I think that cleared it up for a number of us. Can I have the next question, please, Joe? So this one, I would love for Brian to go first. We had about 15 people send this question in, but just succinctly, your number one issue, like what has been the biggest challenge for your workers in the ongoing pandemic?
Thank you. It started off slow. Amtrak has gone by the CDC guidelines from the beginning. And if you follow the CDC guidelines, they've changed constantly. So we started off with no masks, not necessary. And then it was, now we can wear masks. So, I mean, Amtrak has kept up pace at all times with what the guidelines are. Some of the biggest challenges we have is, as I like to tell people, it's public transportation. That means you get to ride with the public. And the public isn't always the people you would choose to ride with. So for every person you got that believes that it's going to be, I got to wear my mask and I'm going to clean my seat and everything else, you've got another guy that says, what do you mean I got to wear my mask while I'm sitting on this train? I thought once I got on and sat down, I was good. To Amtrak's credit, they have supported the conductors with, if you don't want to wear your mask, next stop's yours. And we've had no issue with that. So we kindly ask them to put their mask on. We make announcements. Then we strenuously tell them to put their mask on, and then the next stop is theirs. And Amtrak has supported all conductors in that. So I give them credit for that. I've been told personally by one of the vice presidents who was riding my train, I really don't care. If they don't have a mask, get them off the train. So we've had that support. It's a pandemic, you know, it's going to have its issues. I know a lot of people want to know about how bad has it been? What's the situation like? I think Amtrak has done what they can. You got to keep running trains. I see doctors and nurses on my trains every day going from Washington to Baltimore to go up to Johns Hopkins. They got to get to work. We just do the best we can to keep everybody as safe as possible and obey the rules that are in place by either federal government or local jurisdictions or Amtrak. And that varies depending on where you're at.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm really glad to hear that they're backing you up on that too. I've seen a couple people removed at my local station. So, Ron, how about you? What have been the biggest challenges for your workers?
Yeah, a lot of the same stuff, of course, that Brian's experiencing on the corridor. The mask thing is a big one, not so much for me because I'm up in the engine, but for the conductors, enforcement of the mask policy for those conductors who take it very, very seriously. It seems like hardly a trip goes by that there's not passengers who are very resistant, and occasionally passengers literally have to be put off the train, unfortunately, at the next station stop because they refuse. And this can create lots of conflict and problems and discussion and sort of distraction from the job at hand, because a lot of focus is now going towards individual problem passengers. One other thing for us as workers, this is one that's on the job as well as off the job, all through the fall was the question of not knowing, especially for the lower senior people. Am I going to be furloughed? Will I have to exercise my seniority to another crew base? I was in that situation here in Reno. I thought I was going to be headed to California possibly. And so, you know, the insecurity, the lack of knowing what your future holds. And of course, a lot of that is at play right now. The furloughed workers don't know when they'll be called back. They don't know if they'll be called back. None of us know if and when the trains will go back to daily service, although we hope they will, the sooner the better, but we don't know when that is. So I think just the general mood of uncertainty and not knowing what's coming from one day to the next. Plus, like Brian said, with the CDC guidelines changing, and you know, it's everything's a moving target, and we're on unknown territory here. We're not used to it. Like any workers who are working through this pandemic, it's tough turf.
So I'd like to jump in, Maddie, if I could, just as long as we're on the topic of masks and so forth, especially because it looks like we're starting to run out of time, and I don't want us to run out of time before we address this issue. I think it's important for folks on the webinar, and certainly our members, to know that I was part of an interdisciplinary public-private group that was advising the DOT on how to safely reopen the certification system. And we recognized as early as March that the coronavirus threat was largely an airborne threat. And we communicated that up through DOT. We actually had a conference call bringing together our panel of experts, which included some physicians and public health specialists, with the FRA, with the FTA, with Amtrak, with some of the other commuter roads, and some DOT folks. And we presented our results there. The good news is that Amtrak has sort of led the way. They have, to the extent that any of us can do this well, they have tried to do this well. They have tried to be out front on a lot of the safety issues. And you know, what a lot of folks don't necessarily recognize is that a typical Amtrak coach replaces the air about 15 times an hour. And what that means is that you can completely turn over the air in a given coach every 4 to 6 minutes, depending on the coach and some various characteristics. From what we know about the way that the coronavirus spreads as an aerosolized virus, that's a pretty rapid air turnover and can really go a long way towards keeping folks safe when they're traveling on Amtrak. The volume of air replacement, the air changes per hour, ACH, is a very important number. And both trains and, let's be candid, airplanes do pretty well on that score. The bigger issue is in stations, waiting areas, places where you would be potentially standing next to someone near one, and that's where the social distancing really comes into play. But Amtrak has they've tried to do as good a job as they possibly can. I got to agree with Brian. You know, nothing's going to be perfect, especially when the way the guidelines changed repeatedly. But they really were there first, and the air changes per hour on an Amtrak train are pretty robust, and that's a pretty good level of safety considering where we're at. The other thing to keep in mind is that Amtrak has limited bookings to 50% of capacity. So when they talk about a train being sold out, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are cheek by jowl. It means that the 50% of the seats that they've made available, all 50% of them are sold. So you still they are still limiting the number of folks that they're putting onto the train in order to encourage social distancing. Individual trains, you may see people behave differently. And I imagine that some conductors are more aggressive than others in enforcing it. But certainly, like I said, Brian and I have known each other a long time. I've seen him enforce rules on trains, and I got to believe his brothers and sisters out there are just as good at it as he is.
Thank you, Jim.
I feel good about that.
Thank you for that, John. Can I have the next slide, please, Joe? So this question is specifically for Jeans-Gail. I understand that Amtrak is not hiring anyone new as of now due to the lack of funds and furloughs among current employees. But will they hire new people as soon as a deal is reached? And do you feel that Amtrak is properly funded at this time?
Well, again, I think Brian and Ron might be able to speak to this in terms of from their perspective better than I. However, I did want to highlight some language included in this most recent, I guess, the CARES 2 Acts, or the Gang of 748, whatever you want to call it. That said, specifically, COVID-19 relief funds included must prevent further furloughs that happen as a result of the pandemic, prevent further reductions to the frequencies. Any Amtrak employee who was furloughed as a result of the pandemic will be given the opportunity to be recalled to work in accordance with their seniority and classification of work when service is restored. And then, of course, it also specifies Amtrak may not contract out any scope covered work conducted by an employee who was furloughed through reductions that happened as a result of the pandemic. And so I think there are certain protections in place as well as requirements that it's kind of last one out, first one in. And then I don't know if Brian or Ron has any specific.
I'll speak to that. What everybody may forget is coming into March of this year, we were on pace at Amtrak to have the best year we'd ever had fiscally. We were actually getting ready to announce we were turning a profit. And literally like a week after that announcement, the world fell apart. Amtrak was hiring engineers and conductors as quick as they possibly could, getting prepared for the new Acela fleet that's supposed to come out at the end of the year. The majority of the people that ended up getting furloughed have been hired in the last 2 years. Where normally a furlough cut this deep would have gone to people with 6, 7, 8 years of seniority. I don't think we lost anybody in the Washington region that had less than 4. And it's a testament to how many people had been hired recently. There was, I think Ron probably might know the number better, but there was, I think, something like 100 and some engineer trainees, student engineers, that got furloughed because they cut out the student engineer because of the furloughs coming up in November. So they were hiring. And if they get the money, they're going to bring them back. If you think about 1986, when Ron mentioned everybody came over from the freight railroads and Amtrak started, well, you look at the fact that that is 34, 35 years ago. That's about the normal life of a railroad person. They usually do about 35 to 40 years. And most people that came over from the freight railroads back then were guys that had nothing to lose. They had a year or two of seniority. So you mean I can go work daylight hours and not be stuck in a yard at 12 to 4 in the morning? Yeah, sounds great. Where do I sign up? So a lot of those people are getting ready to come up on retirement in the next 5 years. So they're going to have to hire anyways, just to make up for the lost people that are going to be happening in the next 4 to 5 years. So I think it's more a lack of funding and a lack of trains to put them on than it is the will to have them here.
Ron,
And I'll-
anything to add?
Not too much. It's always speculation, whether or not a company will expand or contract. But as far as, if the trains go back, excuse me, to daily service, yeah, all of those furloughed employees will be the ones who have the first right to come back and assume those positions. What we've seen in the freight industry in recent years, when there's deep cuts, a lot of them don't come back. I don't know if that will be the case with Amtrak. We haven't really experienced a whole lot of layoffs at Amtrak, but the freight railroad industry has. And if a worker is furloughed and can find other employment, and it's good employment, they may be recalled and turn it down, in which case there will be potentially more jobs available, but that's anybody's guess. It all partly depends on what the state of the economy is and whether those furloughed employees are able to gain gainful employment at other jobs. So yeah, it remains to be seen.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Next slide, Joe. I feel as though we've kind of answered this question in y'all's presentations. So I think we're just going to go ahead and wrap this up. I want to say thank you to everyone who sent in the questions. And again, we've had so many people reach out. So sometimes these questions are a more condensed version of a number of people's questions. As always, please feel free to shoot them to me for any upcoming webinar. Joe, I'm going to kick it back to you now.
All right, thank you very much. Let me get to the last slide here. So I want to thank Jim, Sean, and Maddie for helping to put this together with all the precisions. I want to thank our guests, Brian and Ron. That was excellent. I've said this before. I come from a Chicago Teamster household. So while not exactly this, my dad was a truck driver. So this is the unions in general is something very near and dear to my heart. So I want to thank everybody for attending, for everyone, for all of you in attendance, for joining us. Next month, we're going to be hitting up state-supported routes with presentations featuring members from Train Riders Northeast, Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, and the Northern Flyer Alliance. So that's going to be a really great way to start off 2021. That's going to be on Wednesday, January 27th. And for me and for all of us here at the Rail Passenger Association, all our staff, happy holidays. Be out, stay safe. If you must travel, do what you must. As you heard from everybody, mask up, be protected, and see you all next year. Take care.